What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and in today's episode of the Fighting Game Tutorial Series, we are going to be going over a specific mechanic that was requested called Instant Block. An Instant Block is a mechanic in Guilty Gear. Instant Block is a mechanic where if you are to press any of your back buttons, or basically go into the blocking state off of your button press, and you had pressed the back button within 2 or 3 frames of receiving the attack, then you will perform an Instant Block. So we're going to have 2 episodes on Instant Block. We're going to have one episode with the manual block button, because we do support that in the series, and that is this episode. And then we're going to have another episode with any of the back buttons. So backing away, standard block when backing away, and the crouching block as well, like that. So this is the manual block episode, so I can enter the block state by pressing a button assigned to the block action. So, we are going to show this off a little bit, and in this first episode, we are not going to have any sort of visual indicators of what is going on. So we are going to use our logs here to tell us exactly what's going on. Let's clear the log to make it as simple as possible. So down here, you're going to see some logs printing when I do certain actions. First things first, let's actually test out an instant block. So if I block with my one character and attack with the other, you can see nothing printed relating to instant block. All that happened was the character used the light attack, which is true. The second player did use their light attack. The game ended due to timeout, so I restarted here, but we're on the same session. You can see the same log is printed. Now, let's go ahead and perform an instant block. So I'm going to attack with character 2 first, and then I'm going to block with character 1 right before the attack connects. And I have a much more generous window. I believe I have a window of 8 frames I've set it to right now, not 2 or 3. And it is still sometimes difficult for me to get correct. But you can see there's a log now. The character performed an instant block by pressing the block input within the required frame window. And we can do this again. If I release my block, let's go for it. See if I can. There we go. So you can see I pressed it again and performed the instant block because I'm blocking close enough to the time we've received the attack. Now there's another part of this, and that is you can't just spam block, because if I'm doing this, then of course I would probably end up blocking or pressing the block input within the given number of frames before receiving the attack. That would probably have that result. So we need a little bit of spam protection in here, and I have a log printing that does just that. I am going to clear this log though so that we can actually see what's going on. So here, rounds ending again due to timeout. And so we don't want an instant block to occur if I have pressed the block button too close. So too often within too few frames, we don't want to activate an instant block. So this rate is okay. If I start pressing it faster and faster, eventually I will reach a point where these logs start to print because I have entered the block state too many times in too few frames. So instant block is invalidated. And we can test this now. So if I'm spamming with this character, spamming with this character and attacking with the other, you'll notice that that definitely would have been, I definitely pressed it within the right number of frames, and there is no log for performing an instant block because instant block was invalidated due to the spamming. Now, after a short time, I believe it is only 5 frames in the current setup, that spam protection will go away and I can instant block again. So I can do all this, alright, I can spam and invalidate my instant block, and then I can take a second, I can get attacked, and then I can perform an instant block just like that, and you can see it does work as it should. So we have our instant block system that is set up just like Guilty Gears, where we actually perform the instant block when blocking within a given number of frames, but we also have some protection in there so that we can't just continuously spam. Again, this is just for the manual input, but in the next episode we'll cover the directional, so pressing back and back down, and even back up if you want, if you're doing like a jump block. They will all work with the method in the next episode, but understand that the next episode is going to build heavily off of this episode, so I don't recommend that if you are skipping manual block but want to use instant block in your game, that you skip this episode, as we will definitely be using the logic from today's episode in that episode. Also, in the next episode, we will add a little shine effect to the character when they perform an instant block, as well as a little notification that lets the player know the instant block was successful. Now, there are some benefits of instant block that I don't showcase right here, but we will be showcasing later in this episode, and that is chip damage is ignored, pushback is set back to 0 for the defender, so the attacker still receives their pushback, but the defender does not. And of course, you can then punish some attacks more easily because that pushback wasn't granted to the defender. Once they do that instant block, they can go directly into an attack after that. Anyway, that's my demonstration for instant block, and that is the topic we're going to be covering today. But before we hop into the series, if you want to get caught up in the entire playlist, check out every episode we've done. I'll link you to it right here in the top right corner. You can see every mechanic that we've implemented, from our throws, attacks, level streaming, fireballs, whatever it may be. Alternatively, if you don't care about that, but you do care about the instant block system, then I would recommend that you watch this episode right here, which is where we actually set up our standard block system, which of course we're going to be using to perform our instant block today. And with all that out of the way, we are ready to get started, so let's hop into it. Now, this series is a C++ and Blueprint tutorial series. We're going to be doing everything in the code today. We can hop right into the code today, and the only files we really need are our fighter template character files or our base character files. So let's go into them. We are going to start with the fighter template character.h. So we're going to click into our base character.h file, and we're going to scroll down. We need quite a few variables here. I made 4 new variables for this episode. Scroll into where my variables are. They're all going to be integers. So I have them all right here. Alright, let's just go down these one at a time. So the first variable I have here is the frame window instant block. This is the number of frames between pressing the block button and receiving an attack. That is considered an instant block. So if you press the block button 300 frames before receiving the attack, well, that's not an instant block. But if we press it within 8 frames of receiving the attack, then that is considered an instant block. So this is called frame window instant block. You can call this whatever you want. I like to use camel case, with the first letter being lowercase, with the first letter of every other word being capitalized, and I hate that instant block is a term that is capitalized, and so to put instant block with a lowercase I just doesn't feel right to me, so I'm going to put instant block somewhere in the middle or at the end of all these variables. So frame window instant block is being set to 8, and you might be wondering, why am I setting it here? We always set our variables in the constructor, and you'd be right. But when we have a constant variable, this is a value that is not expected to change. We have some constants in our game, and really I haven't covered a ton of them yet, but these are values that aren't going to change. And so in this case, I don't think instant block frame window ever needs to change. If you want to change it due to modifiers in your game or whatever, great. You don't need to put constant in here. But I don't think we need to do that. And so I'm going to put constant integer frame window instant block equals 8. And I'm assigning this variable to 8 or 8 frames, and we don't need to set it in the constructor. We can just leave it in this file. Another thing you'll notice is that it is not uProperty. Now the real reason this uProperty is commented out is because we can't edit this value. When we're trying to use Blueprint read write or edit anywhere, we are not going to be able to do that because this is a constant value that we're not supposed to be changing, and so Unreal actually will give an error. Now, you can change these to be visible anywhere in Blueprint read only, and you can actually get this working and display a constant value in your blueprints if you want. I didn't end up needing it, so I'm just taking this line out, but I did want to show you that you might run into some errors if you try and copy the uProperty from some of your other lines onto these constant values. So just be aware of that. That is important to know. Alright, and then the next variable we need is the frames between instant block attempts. So this is the instant block spam protection that I was showing you earlier. So as the comment says, the number of frames that must pass between block inputs to avoid being locked out of instant blocks. And that's exactly right. Since we don't want to allow the player to keep spamming the block button and receive an instant block, we need to be able to lock them out for a little bit. And so I've set the lockout time to be 10 frames. Now this is really quick. Remember that the game typically runs at 60 FPS, 60 frames per second. So 10 frames is only 1/6 of a second. But it's long enough that it will stop that spamming and make the player actually perform the instant block more accurately. They can still get lucky and execute it sometimes, but it's not exactly the same as if we had no spam protection at all. This is also a constant integer. Again, you don't have to. You could make this modifiable. I'm making it a constant. This is just to kind of show off that we don't need this value changing, and also introduce you to consts in this series. We haven't used it much, and it's very important. It could be very useful for things like this. Better on performance. The next variable is not a constant. This is the number of frames until the instant block attempt. So we have the maximum amount of frames between instant block attempts. That's 10. However, we need to keep track of how many frames have passed since we got that lockout or that spam protection enabled, and we need to know how many frames are left until we can actually try to perform an instant block. This value does need to change, although we don't need it in the blueprints right now. I did make this one uProperty, so it is uProperty, edit anywhere, blueprint read write with a category of block. And again, that is an integer, num frames until instant block attempt. Lastly, we have one more integer, which is the start frame instant block, and this is going to keep track of the first frame that we had triggered the block input on. Let's say we are on frame 0 to 59, like we have in our input buffer, and it just keeps looping. Once you reach frame 59, it goes back to 0. So you have 60 frames, and that basically represents 1 second of gameplay. So if we press an input on frame 32, we have an 8-frame window. If we then receive an attack on frame 35, those are only 3 frames apart. That means that was a successful instant block. So we need to keep track of what frame the block was input on. That way we can actually check to see if the instant block has succeeded. This has the added benefit of being able to assign it a -1 value, which means there's no opportunity for instant block. There's 2 main cases for this. The first case would be the character has not entered any sort of blocking state, and thus there's no way we could instant block. The second case is the player was spamming the button and they ended up entering that spam protection or that lockout state for the instant block. And so we just want to set our start frame instant block to be -1. And in that case, they won't be able to perform the instant block, even if otherwise they met it, right? Because even if the start frame and the attack are within that 8-frame window, we don't want to perform it if they're locked out. So a value of -1 indicates no opportunity for instant block. Alright, with all that out of the way, we can go into the fighterTemplateCharacter.cpp and go to the constructor. Even though we don't need to set the constant values in the constructor, we should be setting those other variables in the constructor. So I'm going to scroll down, and I have both my variables here, my num frames until instant block attempt, and we're going to set that to 0, because when the character spawns in, they can perform an instant block on their first block attempt if they do it correctly, so there's no reason to make them wait for any reason. And the start frame instant block value is going to be set to -1 by default. There's no opportunity for an instant block because they haven't blocked yet. This will of course be updated as soon as they do, but right now they haven't, so -1 is a good value for that. Now the first place we need to go is where we enter our block input, and for me I have a function called start manually blocking, and that is right here. So start manually blocking is where we press the block input, we add it to the input buffer, then we check and make sure we are able to block, so we're not currently in a combo and we have the ability to move. Then we set is manually blocking to be true. Once we know that we are blocking, we have to determine if we're regular blocking or crouch blocking, and they are different. Blocking is just if we're doing a standing block. Could also be an air block in our case because we haven't set one up, but that probably should be a separate state. And the crouch block requires you to be crouching. Then we add the input icon to the screen. This only happens in practice mode, so if we have the input stack shown, we add the block input. All of that has been logic we've already covered in previous episodes. I've added new logic today, and notice that it is within this first if statement here, if can move and the combo state equals none. So if we're not in a combo and we have the ability to move, that's the only time we can perform a manual block. And so we don't want to do any of the logic for instant blocking unless we have the ability to block. So I have put my logic for this episode inside of that if statement. And that's pretty important. Otherwise, we could perform it in the middle of a combo when we're block stun, and we wouldn't want that. Now for the actual logic in here, this is going to be used to track the block inputs to enable spam protection. Also, we are going to set the initial frame where the block input was added. First thing we want to do is check to see if our num frames until instant block attempt is less than or equal to 0. If it's less than or equal to 0, that means the player or the character can perform an instant block, assuming they press the block input at the right time. So they are not locked out due to spam protection, and they are able to perform an instant block. What we need to do is set our start frame instant block equal to the current frame that we're on. Remember my 0 to 59 example earlier? That's exactly what we're doing here. We're going to use our curd tick variable. This function is called as soon as the block input is pressed. Current tick is a variable we set up in the series that we increment every single frame. So it keeps track of our current frame, but it only keeps the values of 0 to 59. It's set up this way so we can basically track every frame of each second. So if we set our start frame instant block, we're setting it to the first frame that the manual block button was pressed, because that is the current frame, and this function is called the exact same frame the button is pressed. Long story short, set start frame instant block equal to the current frame that you are on in your game. Now, at this point, we have already pressed block once, so to avoid being considered spamming the button, we need to figure out how many frames are between instant block attempts or block inputs. So this value we were checking at the start to see if it was less than or equal to 0, we need to now update it. We press the block button, so we have to wait a given number of frames before pressing it again if we want to perform an instant block. So num frames until instant block attempt equals frames between instant block attempts. Remember, this is the constant integer that we have in our file. And specifically, it is set to 10. We have 10 frames between pressing the block inputs. So this will be set to 10 frames. Now, if we press block again before this value reaches 0 or less than 0, although it's not really possible, but just an edge case if it ever happened for any reason, we would go into this else statement, because num frames until instant block attempt is not less than or equal to 0. Say there's 5 frames left. Well, we would enter the else statement. Now in here is where I have my log to print out and say that the instant block is invalidated. This isn't required, but it's good for testing, especially on this first episode of instant block, since we don't have visual cues like the character flashing white or any screen notifications to tell the player that they have succeeded at performing the instant block. If you're not familiar with logs, you can copy this. Basically, you have your UE log function, you have the log that it's going to, the severity of the log, warning will be yellow, and then you have your actual text that you want to display. And I just say, the character has entered the blocking state too often in few frames, I'm going to say in too few frames, instant block is invalidated. Now, additionally, we have to make sure that we set our start frame instant block to be -1. Remember that -1 means there's no chance at an instant block, so this essentially just invalidates the instant block from occurring when we receive the hit, no matter what. At this point, they're locked out, but we still need to reset the number of frames until the next instant block attempt. Every time the player presses it, even if they're already locked out, it resets to the maximum value. So I'm setting num frames until instant block attempt equal to my frames between instant block attempts. And also, I'm just realizing this now, but I'm just repeating logic here, so I might as well take it outside of the if and else statements and just put it directly below them, still within this first if statement. So this is the logic we're adding for today's episode in the start manually blocking function. All right, and at this point, we now have tracked when the first input was given and if we are entering a lockout or a spam protection state. The next thing we care about is our take damage function, because that is where we receive the hit, and that's where we want to check and see if an instant block has been performed or not. So let's go to the take damage function. Here we take damage. Now, I have a ton of logic in here. However, the main thing is you want to go to your logic where the block is occurring. Whether it's manual block or automatic block, you're going to end up in the same logic and take damage. My first if statement that I have here with all these states is the character is not able to successfully block. So of course we don't want to check that one. We want to go down until we get to the corresponding else, which is right here. And because these functions are quite long, you can actually check this by following the lines in Visual Studio. Here is my bracket. I can scroll down, leaving my mouse in place. And here is the else statement. So this else statement means the character was successfully able to block the attack. The very first thing before we do anything else, I'm going to check to see if we performed an instant block or not. This is because performing an instant block usually has the benefit of receiving no chip damage and invalidating pushback. So we want to do this before we give damage to the player or before we push them back. So first things first, I add a boolean performed instant block and I set it equal to false by default because most of the time we probably haven't performed an instant block. But if we have, we want to do additional things and so we need to track it. My if statement here is going to work for almost all cases. There's one edge case that I will mention in a few minutes. But this will work for pretty much every case for instant block. So we need to make sure that our start frame instant block is greater than -1. If it is equal to -1 or somehow less than -1, then we know that it is an invalid opportunity. The player or the character cannot perform an instant block, so we immediately just want to skip this and perform instant block will remain false. However, if it's not -1, that means they did not get locked out and they have pressed a block input, so they have the opportunity to perform an instant block. The other thing we need to check, though, is if it was within the given window. Now, a simple way to check that works for most cases is like this. We have our current tick, or the current frame that we're on, and we want to check and make sure it's greater than or equal to the start frame instant block. We also want to make sure that the current tick is less than or equal to the start frame instant block plus the frame window instant block. The frame window instant block is our other constant integer. This is the actual window that we have for pressing the block input and receiving a hit to actually have completed the instant block. And so the current tick being less than start frame instant block plus frame window instant block works because of this. Let's pull up Paint. Do a quick mathematical operation here. So say we block on a random frame. Let's pick 10 for simplicity. This is when we press the block button. So we're going to say block. That's B for block. And then let's say we have R for receive. This is for receiving a hit. And say we receive the hit on frame 15. That is a clear difference of 5 frames. We're checking if current tick is less than or equal to start frame instant block plus frame window instant block. And so if we go back into Paint, let's say our actual window is 8 frames, okay? Because that is the truth. That is what we're using, 8 frames. Now we have all the information we need. So this received is really your current tick because we're calling take damage. We call take damage as soon as we receive damage, which means the current tick that we have is the frame we received it. So we're really checking to see if 15 is less than or equal to 10 plus 8. And it is, because this is 15 is less than or equal to 18. Well, it falls within that window. So we have successfully pressed the button within the given window of frames, and we can say that we have instant blocked. Now, if we give one more example, let's just go ahead and show the opposite. We can keep the same frame window, and we can even keep the same frame that we press the block input on, but let's change when we receive the hit. Let's say we change it to 19. All right, now what are we going to do? We're going to do 19 is less than or equal to 10 plus 8. And that's going to be 19 is less than or equal to 18, which is false. It did not fall within that window. We received the hit too late, or rather we pressed the block button too early, and so we were not able to perform the instant block. So that's really what we're checking here. The reason we have this other check to make sure that the current tick is greater than or equal to the start frame instant block is because of what I mentioned earlier about there being a small little edge case that we need to keep track of. Now the real reason for this is because the current tick remembers a value of 0 to 59 and it repeats. So if we had pressed the instant block button on frame 59, the last frame before current tick resets, 8 frames later, you're actually on frame 7. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And so cur tick is going to be less than start frame instant block. You're going to have frame 7 is less than frame 59. There's actually a quite simple way to fix this, and we're going to do just that. But we'll do it after the rest of the logic inside this if statement because I want to test it and show you the differences visually. So just leave it alone for now, but keep that in mind. Now you know why there's a little edge case there, and you'll see why and how we can fix it. Alright, so assuming this if statement is true, that means we have performed an instant block, so I have another UE log with the text, the character performed an instant block by pressing the block input within the required frame window. And that's all there is to it. You saw that log printing earlier in my demonstration. And we want to set performed instant block to be true. At this point, you can do anything else within this logic using this performed instant block variable and do certain actions, such as nullifying damage, if it is true. So see how I have my float reduced damage equals damage amount times 0.5f. That is the chip damage in my case. It's just a hard-coded value. But really, what we should do if we want to use this instant block mechanic properly is not do times 0.5f. If we were to perform the instant block, this reduced damage should be 0. We should really decrement 0. Or we should skip this operation as a whole. I don't want to skip it as a whole because I have some things like last damage received that get set. And these are for practice mode. But if a character instant blocks, no damage is received, I want it to show that no damage was received from that instant block. So instead of just skipping this logic, we're just going to actually incorporate it into the logic. There's a lot of ways you can do this. A fun way to do it is just to check if performed instant block. And if you go inside this if statement, reduced damage equals 0.0f. That's a really good way. I mean, it's very simple. This still calculates the chip damage if you need to for any reason, and this invalidates it. So you keep all the data that you passed in, but now reduced damage will be 0. None will be subtracted from the player health. The other thing is the pushback. So if we scroll down, we have perform pushback right here. We have 2 perform pushback calls here. One is for the attacker, other player perform pushback. One is for the defender, just perform pushback. The attacker should still receive their pushback, but the defender should not. So we can just check if not performed instant block and only perform the pushback if the defender did not perform an instant block. If they did, no pushback should occur. Now let's scroll back up to this logic here where we were checking for the instant block, and we'll take care of this. This edge case is a thing because the current tick goes from 0 to 59 as I mentioned earlier, and so when we are checking frames here to see if we're within a given range, we need to make sure that that system also follows the same rules. So we need to check between 0 and 59. So in this case, we need to update our logic to, instead of being if we are greater than the starting frame, the starting input of the block, and if we are less than the starting frame plus the frame window, because the frame window could cause the starting frame to roll over. If the starting frame is at frame 58, the window is 8 frames, then we will actually end up at frame 7. That is the maximum frame that the player could receive an attack and still get the instant block effect. And that number is not going to be less than our current tick if they had blocked on frame 59, for example. Because of that rollover, there are some edge cases. Basically, what we want to happen is we want to convert this AND into an OR. I'll explain this more in a few minutes because we will figure out exactly why. But that is really our end goal here, because we want to be able to be either above the start frame or below the the ending frame, right? So we know if we're above the start frame and below the ending frame, we are within that window. So we're going to make sure that we make a new variable here to keep track of our maximum frame. Basically the last frame within the window of the instant block buffer there. So we have the starting frame plus the 8 frame window. That is going to be our maximum frame, or the last frame that we can still perform the instant block if we receive an attack on that frame. We want to make sure that it is never outside of the bounds that current tick follows, and that is 0 to 59. So if this max frame is above 59, we can assume it is at least 60 or higher, in which case we can subtract 60 to make it follow the same rules that current tick does. Because if it's frame 60, minus 60 will put it back to frame 0, which is exactly what we want. If it's 61, it'll be frame 1, and so on and so forth. Now we can replace our logic in our if statement to be this new variable instead of the starting frame plus the frame window, since that is what this new variable is. Makes it a little bit cleaner, but also we do that conversion, so it can't be a number higher than 60 like it could in the past. At this point, we're really close to the logic we want, but we're not quite there. This gives way too much leniency. If our initial frame that we blocked on was 0, cur tick could be any of the other 59 frames, and it would be considered valid. That's not what we want, so we need to separate this logic. We only want to do this logic if we had to account for the rollover, the 59 back to 0. So we're going to put this inside of the if statement that we have right here. And doing that will mean only if we do that rollover, we will set the instant block to be true at this point. That's not all we want to do. We do still want to be able to perform an instant block when we're not in this edge case. So go to the end of the if statement here, and we're going to add an else condition. And the else condition is just going to be when the frames don't fall in that rollover. We still need an if statement, and it's going to be very similar to the if statement that we already had in the past. So we're going to check and make sure that the starting frame is a valid one, that the current tick is greater than or equal to the starting frame, and the current tick is less than or equal to the maximum frame. If you're greater than the starting frame, but less than the maximum frame, you know you're in the proper range. Let's go ahead and give an example of this now to make sure that everything is working as intended. So I've opened up Paint, and we're going to start with our block frame, and we're going to use 13 as our number. Let's then go to the frame we received the hit. We'll mark that for current tick, because that's what that is, and we'll say that that was received on frame 15, and the window is our 8 frames. We are not going to be above 59 because 13 plus 8 is only going to equal 21. And so we don't have any rollover. There is no need to use that logic, in which case we will go into the else statement that we just set up. And so in this else statement, we have to make sure that the current tick is greater than or equal to the starting frame and is less than or equal to the starting frame plus the window. So the first condition here, 15 is greater than or equal to 13, which is absolutely true. The other condition is that 15 is going to be less than or equal to 21. 21 comes from 13 plus 8, or the first frame we blocked plus the frame window. This is 21. Now we meet both of these requirements, which is good because we need to meet both of them due to this AND statement here to actually perform our instant blocks. We will go into our instant block logic. Now, let's clear everything but the window, and let's go for the rollover case. So we're going to say we first blocked on frame 58, and the current tick is frame 59, one frame later. So following the same rules, we are going to check if 59 is greater than or equal to 58. That is from this if statement right here. And so 59 is greater than or equal to 58. But now we need to figure out what the maximum frame is, or the final frame. That is 58 plus 8. So then we have to check if 59 is less than or equal to 58 plus 8, which is 64. But remember, if it is over 60, or if it is 60 or higher, we're going to decrease 60 from it. So 64 minus 60. And that's going to get us an answer of 4. 59 is not less than or equal to 4. So this fails. However, the top if statement only requires one of the conditions to be correct. If one of the conditions is correct, we still are able to perform the instant block. That's the real difference between these two conditions. the top one is an or, the bottom is an and. And the reason the top one works as an or is because we know that if we are in that rollover period, it only has to be one or the other. It can't be both mathematically. It can either be greater than the starting frame or less than the maximum frame, which is the rolled over frame. It can't be both. But if it falls within that range, it is still accurate to perform an instant block. Let's go ahead and give one more example now, with the frame window still being 8. But we will have our block frame, let's use 58 again, but the current tick this time will be a rolled over current tick, so we'll use 2 as the number. We need to check if 2 is greater than or equal to 58, which it's not going to be. That is going to be false, so this fails. Alright, I rewrote this because it had crashed on me, but the other condition here is 58 plus 8, which becomes 66. So we check to see if 2 is less than or equal to 66. Which, of course, this is true, but we want to make sure that it is within the same rollover range. So 66 minus 60 is actually 6. So 2 is less than or equal to 6 is what we need to be checking. Again, you can see in this rollover logic that only one of the conditions has to be true, and we have one condition true, so this is another successful instant block. Scrolling down now to the last section, we need to go to our tick function. For me, it's all the way at the bottom. So here's my tick function. We need to keep track of the number of frames that have passed between block inputs. That way we can check for the spamming. And remember, we were checking our variable num frames until instant block attempt. We need to make sure we're decrementing this value, so once it is set after pressing a block input, it can also be decreased, and then we can use it again. We don't want to be locked out forever for the rest of the match. We just want to be locked out for a few frames. You can put it most anywhere in tick. Make sure if your tick is like mine, where you do check for custom time dilation being greater than 0, you put this logic in there because we don't want to decrease from the number of frames between the instant blocks if the time dilation is 0. This typically means that someone is doing a super move or hit stop is occurring, and either way we don't want to decrement from those frames. I put it right below where I set my stun frame logic because when we get stunned, we decrement using the same method. But you can really put it wherever you want. So we want to reduce the number of frames remaining for instant block attempts, and we're just going to check and see if num frames until instant block attempt is greater than 0 currently, and if it is, we want to decrement it. Minus num frames until instant block attempt. And eventually it will reach 0, and you won't have to decrement it anymore, and it's ready to go. Once the player presses the block input again, it resets and the process continues. Alright, now at this point, we are good to go. I'm going to close and relaunch since we made some changes in the code. And then I'll catch up with you. We'll show off, make sure everything's working. The pushback and the damage should be invalidated when instant blocking. And we will use our logs here to verify that. So I still have my spamming block will invalidate the instant block. So if I am spamming my block and I get attacked, I will still take damage. I will take the block damage, not the regular damage, assuming I had managed to block the attack at the right time, but I still take damage. It's not invalidated. And so now if I am to instant block, you see no damage occurred and the log printed the character performed instant block. Now, you'll see if I'm blocking, the character is getting pushed back. You can just see it. It's a fact. The characters are farther spaced out now. Now let's meet in the middle again, and I will instant block, and you'll see that no pushback occurred. I actually failed my instant block, so let's try that again. That also failed. I was too early. There we go. No pushback occurred, and I got my instant block. Let's see if we can do it again. There we go. It's a little bit tough for me still, but you can see clearly when we nail the instant block, we don't get pushed back, we don't take damage. So everything is working as expected with our instant block. And that's all we are going to cover for today's episode regarding this topic. So thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please subscribe and consider donating to the Patreon or YouTube membership. Really appreciate all of you who have done it. Thank you so much. It really helps the channel and myself a ton. So I really appreciate it. If you guys have any trouble following this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. I would be happy to help you out. Otherwise, guys, that's all I got. So thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.